Watching the world's most powerful military alliance spend 70 years and approximately $8.4 trillion building a layered, nuclear-backed, globally distributed defense architecture designed to deter and defeat every conceivable strategic threat. And then watching a single weapons test conducted in a desert in Inner Mongolia in the early morning hours of July 3rd render the foundational assumptions of that entire architecture dangerously, fundamentally, and potentially permanently obsolete sounds like the premise of a defense budget hearing that no Pentagon official would ever allow to happen in public. Yet that is precisely what the classified briefing rooms of the United States Department of Defense have been processing in the 72 hours since China's People's Liberation Army rocket force confirmed the successful test of what its internal procurement documents, portions of which have reached Western intelligence services through channels that American officials declined to characterize publicly, designate the DF-ZFX, a fractional orbital bombardment system carrying a hypersonic glide vehicle with a maneuvering payload that combines 3 capabilities no previous weapon system in any nation's inventory has ever simultaneously achieved: global range unrestricted by ballistic trajectory limitations, terminal phase maneuverability that defeats every known kinetic intercept system in the American defense architecture, and an approach geometry that comes not from space through the atmosphere as American missile defense was designed to intercept, but along the surface of the Earth from the Southern Hemisphere, approaching American strategic targets from a direction that the entire network of early warning radars, the ground-based mid-course defense system, the terminal high-altitude area defense batteries, and the Aegis ballistic missile defense ships that constitute America's layered missile defense architecture cannot track until the weapon is approximately 90 seconds from its target. 90 seconds. That is not a narrow targeting window that can be managed by faster computers and better algorithms. That is a physical constraint imposed by the geometry of the weapon's approach that no procurement program, no software upgrade, and no engineering sprint can solve within any timeline that is strategically relevant to the threat that China demonstrated it can deliver on July 3rd. The Pentagon is not panicking because of what China tested. It is panicking because of what it cannot build in time to stop it. To understand why China's test of the DF-ZFX represents not merely a new weapons capability, but a fundamental invalidation of the strategic logic that has governed American defense planning since the Reagan administration's Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, and why the men and women who have spent their careers building, funding, and operating the United States missile defense architecture are sitting in classified briefings this week, discovering that the system they built to protect the American homeland, American allies, and American forward deployed forces cannot engage a weapon that now demonstrably exists in an adversary's operational inventory. We need to understand what America's missile defense was designed to do, why it was designed to do it against the specific threat geometry it was optimized for, and why that optimization has just been exposed as the most strategically consequential single-point failure in the history of American defense planning. America's ground-based mid-course defense system, the GMD, was designed around a single foundational assumption: that ballistic missiles travel in predictable arcs through space. A ballistic missile launched from China toward the continental United States follows a trajectory that takes it out of the atmosphere, through space along a parabolic arc, and back into the atmosphere above the target. The geometry of that trajectory is fixed by the laws of physics. The missile's path through space, once the boost phase is complete, can be calculated with extraordinary precision by any radar system that has detected the missile during its boost phase. That calculability is the foundation of the entire intercept architecture. Every dollar of the approximately $67 billion that the United States has spent on the GMD program since 1999 has been spent on systems whose entire operational logic rests on this specific physical characteristic of ballistic missiles. The DF-ZFX does not travel on a ballistic arc. It travels at hypersonic speed along a depressed trajectory that never leaves the atmosphere, maneuvering continuously throughout its entire flight path, approaching its target from the Southern Hemisphere through a corridor that the GMD's 64 ground-based interceptors in Alaska and California are not positioned to cover, and arriving within the atmosphere at a speed and from a direction that the GMD's X-band radars are not optimally positioned to detect. The $67 billion is not wasted. It will still defeat the specific threats it was designed to defeat, but it will not defeat the DF-ZFX. And that specific incompleteness, the gap between what America spent $67 billion defending against and what China has now demonstrated it can deliver, is the gap that is producing the silence in the classified briefing rooms. The DF-ZFX is a fractional orbital bombardment system, designated FOBS in the Western defense planning literature, that has been discussing this weapons class since the Soviet Union tested the R-36 orb in the 1960s, and the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibited the permanent deployment of nuclear weapons in orbit. The FOBS concept exploits a loophole in the Outer Space Treaty's specific prohibition. The treaty bans nuclear weapons permanently stationed in orbit, but does not ban the use of an orbital trajectory to deliver a weapon that does not complete a full orbit before re-entering the atmosphere. A FOBS weapon is launched into a low Earth orbit, travels along that orbit through space, and then fires a retrorocket to deorbit before completing a single full revolution around the Earth. Because it approaches its target from orbit rather than from a ballistic arc, its trajectory cannot be predicted from its launch point the way a traditional ICBM trajectory can. More critically, a FOBS weapon launched from China toward the continental United States can approach from the south, traveling over the South Pole on a suborbital trajectory that approaches the American heartland from a direction that the entire network of American early warning infrastructure, from the ballistic missile early warning system radars in Greenland, the United Kingdom, and Alaska, to the Defense Support Program and space-based infrared system satellites whose infrared sensors are calibrated to detect the specific heat signature of ICBM boost phases launching from the north, was simply not designed to monitor with the speed and accuracy that a 90-second terminal warning window demands. But the DF-ZFX does not merely combine FOBS orbital geometry with a conventional warhead. It combines the FOBS approach trajectory with a hypersonic glide vehicle payload, a maneuvering aerodynamic body that separates from the FOBS delivery system during the deorbit phase, and then glides at speeds between Mach 10 and Mach 27 through the upper atmosphere, maneuvering both laterally and vertically throughout its terminal approach, presenting a continuously changing predicted impact point that no kinetic interceptor currently in any nation's operational inventory can reliably track and engage. The combination of these two distinct capabilities, the Southern Hemisphere orbital approach geometry that defeats early warning, and the hypersonic maneuvering re-entry vehicle that defeats terminal defense, is not merely additive in its effect on American defense planning. It is multiplicative. Each capability individually would be serious. Together, they create a compound failure mode in the American defense architecture in which the two layers that were supposed to catch what the other missed, early warning enabling mid-course intercept and terminal defense catching what mid-course missed, are both defeated simultaneously by the same weapon using the same flight path. The steel dome of American missile defense, like every steel dome that has ever been examined under sufficient technological pressure in this analysis, is riddled with holes. And for the first time, the weapon that created those holes is not theoretical. It has been tested. It worked. And the people responsible for explaining to the American public and to American allies how their defense systems will stop it do not yet have an answer they believe in. The specific technical architecture of the DF-ZFX must be examined with the granular precision that the situation demands, because the technical details are not incidental to the strategic panic. They are the strategic panic, translated from the language of physics into the language of military consequence. The test on July 3rd covered a range of approximately 7,200 kilometers along a trajectory that American space surveillance sensors tracked from launch to impact in the designated target zone in the Taklamakan Desert with the specific, uncomfortable clarity of intelligence systems that can see exactly what is happening and can calculate, in real time, exactly what it means for the defense architecture they are designed to support. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's analysts, who processed the test data on July 3rd and the morning of July 4th, were not uncertain about what they were looking at. They were certain. And the certainty is what made the briefings on July 4th delivered to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, and ultimately to the President in the Situation Room, the specific kind of briefings that career defense officials describe, in the rare moments when they speak honestly about these things as the briefings that keep you awake. The test was not China's first demonstration of hypersonic glide vehicle technology. China tested the earlier DF-17 hypersonic missile system operationally in 2019 and declared it combat-ready in 2020. The DF-17 is a theater-range weapon with a range of approximately 1,800 to 2,500 kilometers, designed to threaten American carrier strike groups and forward bases in the Pacific, rather than the continental United States. Western defense planners tracked the DF-17's development and incorporated it into their threat models for the Pacific theater with the specific equanimity of professionals who understand that new weapons capabilities require adaptation but do not represent fundamental breaks in the strategic architecture. The DF-ZFX is different in kind, not merely in degree. Where the DF-17 was a tactical and operational level weapon, whose range and targets could be mapped against existing American defensive capabilities in the Pacific theater, the DF-ZFX demonstrated on July 3rd an intercontinental range of approximately 14,000 kilometers, sufficient to reach any target in the continental United States from launch sites in western China, combined with the southern approach geometry and maneuvering terminal phase that places it in the specific threat category for which American strategic defense architecture has no planned response. The combination of FOBS delivery and hypersonic glide vehicle payload creates a compound failure mode in the American defense architecture in which the two layers that were supposed to catch what the other missed are both defeated simultaneously by the same weapon using the same flight path. But here is where the DF-ZFX's strategic implications move from the purely technical into the realm of the geopolitically catastrophic, and where the specific nature of Xi Jinping's strategic calculation becomes visible in all of its calculated, patient, and deeply unsettling clarity. Xi did not test the DF-ZFX because China accidentally developed a weapon that exceeded its design parameters and produced an unanticipated strategic breakthrough. He tested it because China deliberately engineered a weapon system specifically designed to invalidate the foundational assumptions of American strategic defense, a weapon whose requirements were defined not by Chinese military doctrine's existing target set, but by a careful analysis of exactly what combination of flight characteristics would create the specific compound failure mode in the American defense architecture that the test on July 3rd demonstrated. This is not an inference. It is a documented fact of Chinese weapons development planning, visible in the publicly available portions of PLA strategic planning documents, in the research output of Chinese defense universities, and in the specific procurement sequence that has led from the DF-17 through the DF-100 anti-ship ballistic missile program to the DF-ZFX, a sequence whose internal logic is not the logic of deterrence maintenance, but the logic of deterrence superiority. China's strategic planners spent decades studying the American missile defense architecture with the specific professional attention of engineers who were looking not for how to match it, but for how to break it. The Southern Hemisphere approach geometry, the hypersonic maneuvering payload, the FOBS orbital delivery mechanism, these are not features that emerge from a general research and development program for advanced delivery systems. They are the specific answers to the specific questions that a weapons development program asks when its design requirement is not how do we deter the United States, but how do we make the United States' deterrence against us ineffective? Xi Jinping has spent the 15 years of his leadership building toward exactly this strategic position, the position in which China possesses a weapon that can reach any target in the continental United States through a flight path that American missile defense cannot reliably intercept. And while the United States does not possess an equivalent weapon that China's own developing missile defense architecture cannot address. The test on July 3rd did not create that position. It certified it. It transformed a classified assessment from a planning assumption into a verified operational fact. And verified operational facts, in the calculus of strategic deterrence, carry a weight that planning assumptions do not. This is not deterrence maintenance. This is deterrence superiority. The specific strategic condition in which one side possesses the ability to threaten the other's homeland, while the other side cannot reliably threaten retaliation at the same level of certainty. That condition, if it persists long enough to become embedded in the strategic calculations of America's allies, America's adversaries, and America's own decision-makers, does not merely shift the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. It reshapes the entire architecture of the international order that American primacy has underwritten since 1991. The panic inside the Pentagon, and panic is not too strong a word, as the specific pattern of behavior visible in the defense establishment's response over the past 72 hours, conforms precisely to the institutional indicators that defense scholars use to identify genuine strategic crisis rather than manage strategic concern, is not primarily about the weapon itself. Military establishments deal with new weapons, they adapt, they develop countermeasures, they revise their planning assumptions and update their procurement priorities. The behavior visible in the Pentagon over the past 72 hours is not the behavior of an institution adapting to a new threat. It is the behavior of an institution confronting the realization that the adaptation required exceeds the timeline available and the resources currently allocated in a way that cannot be resolved by writing a requirements document and sending it to the defense industrial base. The ground-based interceptor program, which forms the kinetic kill backbone of the GMD system, requires a minimum of 7 years from program initiation to operational deployment for a new interceptor variant. The next-generation interceptor program, currently in development, is designed to defeat targets that are more complex than current Soviet-era ICBM threat surrogates, but was not designed against the specific flight characteristics of a FOBS plus hypersonic glide vehicle combination, meaning its design requirements will need to be revised, its development timeline reset, and its cost estimates rebaselined, a process whose bureaucratic and procurement mechanics alone will require 2 to 3 years before new physical hardware can begin testing. The Hypersonic and Ballistic Tracking Space Sensor Program, which is supposed to provide the persistent space-based tracking infrastructure that could potentially provide sufficient warning against a FOBS approach weapon, was supposed to achieve initial operational capability in 2026, but has been subject to repeated funding gaps and technical delays that have pushed its timeline into the late 2020s. In the late 2020s, in the assessment of American intelligence agencies that monitor Chinese weapons development timelines, the DF-ZFX will not still be in a testing phase, it will be in an operational deployment phase. The timeline of the American response intersects the timeline of the Chinese threat at a crossover point that the Pentagon's most optimistic procurement projections place at approximately 2032, and whose most pessimistic projections do not reach a crossover point within any planning horizon currently under active development. The directed energy weapons programs, high-energy laser and high-power microwave systems that could theoretically provide an engagement capability against hypersonic glide vehicles during the terminal phase, are currently funded at approximately $900 million per year across all service programs, operating at a technology readiness level that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency assesses as requiring approximately 8 to 12 additional years of development before achieving the power levels and beam control precision required for operational use against a Mach 15 maneuvering target. The alliance dimension of what the DF-ZFX test means for America's network of treaty commitments in the Indo-Pacific cascades through the strategic landscape, with an accelerating force that American officials are working extraordinarily hard to manage in the classified briefings being delivered this week to Allied capitals. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines are each receiving briefings that must accomplish the nearly impossible simultaneous task of communicating the severity of what the DF-ZFX test represents, while maintaining the credibility of the American security guarantee that forms the foundation of each nation's defense planning. If China can now hold American cities at risk through a delivery system that American missile defense cannot reliably intercept, while the United States cannot hold Chinese cities at equivalent risk without accepting the risk of Chinese retaliation through the same system, the symmetry of mutual vulnerability on which the entire architecture of extended deterrence rests has been fractured. American allies who have built their defense planning around the assumption that American nuclear deterrence is credible enough to deter Chinese conventional aggression are now facing the possibility that China has acquired, or is acquiring, the specific capability to break that deterrence credibility at the nuclear level without breaking it at the conventional level. The Allied capitals that are listening to the American briefings this week are not merely processing what the briefers are telling them, they are processing what the briefers are not saying. And what the briefers are not saying, in the careful diplomatic language of classified alliance communication, speaks louder than everything they are. The domestic political dimension of the DF-ZFX test's impact inside American strategic planning institutions will reverberate through defense budgets, procurement priorities, and the specific political contest between competing visions of American strategic posture for years to come. The American defense industrial base, which has spent the past decade primarily optimized for the counterinsurgency and near-peer attrition warfare models that dominated American strategic thinking from 2001 through approximately 2018, is not currently configured to rapidly produce the specific systems, space-based sensor architectures, directed energy weapons, next-generation interceptors, low-observable hypersonic counterweapons, that a credible response to the DF-ZFX would require. Reconfiguring it requires not merely funding and political will, but the specific kind of manufacturing workforce development, supply chain restructuring, and engineering talent reallocation whose timelines are measured not in fiscal years, but in decades. The United States produced in 2024 approximately 48 ground-based interceptors, the kinetic kill vehicles that form the backbone of the GMD's response to ballistic missile threats. The production line that makes these interceptors, operating at surge capacity, produces approximately 60 per year. The DF-ZFX is not a ballistic missile. The ground-based interceptor is not designed to engage it. The production surge that the Pentagon is now being asked to execute will produce more of a weapon that cannot stop the specific threat that China has just demonstrated it can deliver. The alliance dimension of what the DF-ZFX test means for America's network of treaty commitments in the Indo-Pacific cascades through the strategic landscape, with an accelerating force that American officials are working extraordinarily hard to manage in the classified briefings being delivered this week to Allied capitals. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines are each receiving briefings that must accomplish the nearly impossible simultaneous task of communicating the severity of what the DF-ZFX test represents, while maintaining the credibility of the American security guarantee that forms the foundation of each nation's defense planning. If China can now hold American cities at risk through a delivery system that American missile defense cannot reliably intercept, while the United States cannot hold Chinese cities at equivalent risk without accepting the risk of Chinese retaliation through the same system, the symmetry of mutual vulnerability on which the entire architecture of extended deterrence rests has been fractured. American allies, who have built their defense planning around the assumption that American nuclear deterrence is credible enough to deter Chinese conventional aggression, are now facing the possibility that China has acquired, or is acquiring, the specific capability to break that deterrence credibility at the nuclear level without breaking it at the conventional level. The Allied capitals that are listening to the American briefings this week are not merely processing what the briefers are telling them, they are processing what the briefers are not saying. And what the briefers are not saying, in the careful diplomatic language of classified alliance communication, speaks louder than everything they are. The domestic political dimension of the DF-ZFX test's impact inside American strategic planning institutions will reverberate through defense budgets, procurement priorities, and the specific political contest between competing visions of American strategic posture for years to come. The American defense industrial base, which has spent the past decade primarily optimized for the counterinsurgency and near-peer attrition warfare models that dominated American strategic thinking from 2001 through approximately 2018, is not currently configured to rapidly produce the specific systems, space-based sensor architectures, directed energy weapons, next-generation interceptors, low observable hypersonic counterweapons, that a credible response to the DF-ZFX would require. Reconfiguring it requires not merely funding and political will, but the specific kind of manufacturing workforce development, supply chain restructuring, and engineering talent reallocation whose timelines are measured not in fiscal years, but in decades. The United States produced in 2024 approximately 48 ground-based interceptors, the kinetic kill vehicles that form the backbone of the GMD's response to ballistic missile threats. The production line that makes these interceptors, operating at surge capacity, produces approximately 60 per year. The DF-ZFX is not a ballistic missile. The ground-based interceptor is not designed to engage it. The production surge that the Pentagon is now being asked to execute will produce more of a weapon that cannot stop the specific threat that China has just demonstrated it can deliver. The specific human dimension of what the DF-ZFX test means for the American military personnel and defense workers who have spent their careers building and operating the systems that China's test has just demonstrated, it can defeat, must be reckoned with, alongside the strategic and institutional analysis. The men and women who work at Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado, where the operational center for the ground-based mid-course defense system is housed, are professionals who have dedicated years and in many cases decades to understanding, maintaining, and operating a system they believed, and were told, and had every professional reason to accept, could defend the American homeland against the ballistic missile threats that it was designed to stop. They did not build the wrong system. They built exactly the system they were asked to build, against exactly the threats they were asked to address. The DF-ZFX does not expose a failure of their professional execution. It exposes a failure of strategic imagination at the level of requirements definition, the level at which someone with the authority and the foresight to ask, what if China builds a weapon that approaches from the south through a depressed trajectory, failed to ask that question with sufficient urgency to change the requirements before the requirements became a system that was built and deployed and funded for 26 years. That failure of strategic imagination did not belong to the people operating the system. It belonged to the people who defined its requirements. And the specific frustration of watching a system you built and operate be rendered obsolete by a threat that was theoretically predictable, but practically ignored in the requirements process, is the specific professional experience of the defense workforce that the public briefings of the next several months will never fully capture. The economic dimension of what a credible response to the DF-ZFX would require produces the kind of numbers that Pentagon budget officials write in memos that begin with the phrase, subject to congressional appropriations. The hypersonic and ballistic tracking space. Sensor Constellation currently has a program of record budget of approximately $4.6 billion for an initial constellation of 12 satellites. 12 satellites provide insufficient coverage against the specific threat geometry of the DF-ZFX's southern approach corridor. A constellation adequate for the DF-ZFX threat would require approximately 36 to 48 satellites in polar orbit at a procurement cost estimated between $12 and $18 billion, with a launch and integration timeline of approximately 7 to 9 years from program authorization. The directed energy weapons programs are funded at approximately $900 million per year, and are assessed as requiring approximately 8 to 12 additional years of development before achieving the power levels required for operational use against a Mach 15 maneuvering target. The next generation interceptor is funded at approximately $1.3 billion per year, and is currently projected to achieve initial operational capability in 2028. But its performance requirements were specified before the DF-ZFX's specific flight characteristics were known with a precision that the July 3rd test has now provided, meaning its design baseline will need to be renegotiated. The total additional investment that a credible response to the DF-ZFX would require across space-based sensors, directed energy systems, next-generation interceptors, and the command and control architecture that integrates them is not a number that any current defense planning document contains, because until 72 hours ago, the DF-ZFX was a threat that existed in classified warning assessments, rather than in the verified operational inventory of an adversary that has just demonstrated it works. It is now in that inventory. The broader global strategic landscape that the DF-ZFX test has altered extends beyond the immediate American-Chinese bilateral competition to reshape every nation's calculation about the relationship between military power and political sovereignty in the emerging multipolar world. The specific lesson that every defense ministry and every heads of state intelligence briefing will draw from July 3rd is not merely that China has a new weapon. It is that the specific form of American primacy that has governed the international order since 1991, the form based on America's ability to project overwhelming conventional force and credible nuclear deterrence into any theater on Earth faster than any adversary can prepare a response, has just encountered a verified technology that does not merely challenge it, but specifically invalidates the physical mechanism through which it operates. Nations that have been making strategic decisions based on the assumption that American deterrence is reliable enough to substitute for their own strategic independence will now be making a different calculation. Some of them will accelerate their own nuclear programs. Some will seek new security arrangements. Some will conclude that accommodation with China offers more security than confrontation, supported by an American deterrent whose reliability has just been called into demonstrable question. The test that China conducted in the Gobi Desert on July 3rd will not change the world in 72 hours, but it has set in motion a cascade of strategic recalculations in capitals from Seoul to Riyadh to Warsaw to New Delhi that will reshape the international order in ways that no single weapon test in the post-Cold War era has previously managed. Xi Jinping is doing something that no amount of American defense budget increases, no acquisition reform, and no technology acceleration program can address at the speed that the strategic situation now demands. He is bailing water from the flooding lower decks of the gap between Chinese weapons, development timelines, and American defense response timelines, and pouring it into the luxury cabin of a strategic position whose superiority window, the window during which China possesses a weapon that the United States cannot reliably stop, is not measured in months, it is measured in years. And years, in the mathematics of strategic deterrence, is an eternity. The Cold War, at its most dangerous moments, produced exactly the institutional responses that the moments required. Sputnik produced the space program and the ICBM, the Soviet acquisition of the atomic bomb, produced the hydrogen bomb and the thermonuclear arsenal. The deployment of Soviet ICBMs produced the Minuteman and the Polaris submarine programs. Each of these responses was produced by an American strategic system that was, at the moment of the catalyzing shock, as uncertain, as frightened, and as bureaucratically complex as the system confronting the DF-ZFX today. What made the Cold War responses adequate was not that the American defense establishment was more capable in those decades than it is now. It was that the catalyzing shocks were recognized as shocks, processed as shocks, and responded to with the urgency that shocks demand. The steel dome of American missile defense, built over 26 years at a cost of $67 billion, was built to block missiles coming from the north through predictable arcs through space. China found a way to come from the south along the surface of the Earth at Mach 15 while maneuvering. Not through the dome, not around the dome. Along the equator, below the dome, approaching from the hemisphere the dome was never oriented to cover. The dome is still there. The interceptors are still in their silos in Alaska and California. They are still in their launch-ready configuration and still reporting operational status to the command network. But the weapon that China tested on July 3rd will not fly through their engagement envelope, and a kinetic interceptor that cannot engage the weapon it was built to stop is not a defense. It is an expensive monument to the specific threat it was designed to defeat, standing watch against a direction from which the actual threat is no longer coming. America's response to what China tested on July 3rd will define the strategic landscape of the next 30 years, not merely because of what weapon system gets funded, or what alliance gets strengthened, or what diplomatic initiative gets launched in the week after the test, but because the response will reveal whether the American strategic system retains the institutional capacity to accurately assess a strategic discontinuity when it encounters one, and to respond with the speed, the resource allocation, and the doctrinal creativity that the discontinuity demands. The question is not whether America can build a defense against the DFZFX. The question is whether the specific institutional, political, and industrial configuration of the American strategic system in 2025 can produce the operational response before the window of Chinese strategic advantage, the window that Xi Jinping has been patiently and methodically engineering for 15 years, closes around America's strategic options with the finality of a system that was designed, from its very first requirements document, to be impossible to escape from the inside. So we want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe China's successful test of the DFZFX, a weapon combining fractional orbital bombardment system geometry with hypersonic maneuvering reentry and a Southern Hemisphere approach corridor that provides only 90 seconds of warning to American defense systems, represents the most significant single shift in the strategic balance between the United States and China since the People's Republic of China first tested nuclear weapons in 1964, and that the window of Chinese strategic advantage it has opened will prove impossible for the American defense establishment to close within the timeline that Xi Jinping's own strategic timetable for Taiwan allows? And has Xi Jinping's 15-year strategy of patiently engineering not a weapon that matches American capability, but a weapon that specifically invalidates the foundational assumptions of American defense architecture, not deterring American deterrence, but defeating it, demonstrated a quality of strategic patience and doctrinal creativity that the American defense establishment optimized for the incremental procurement cycles of peacetime competition rather than the discontinuous leaps of genuine strategic shock, is structurally incapable of matching at the speed that the threat timeline now demands. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. To make long journeys more enjoyable, we also welcome you to our Spotify, where we present our video content in audio format. TGN presented.